make eye contact with me, that means you know the answer. Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, so we don't get too attached to this word. We're just strangers here with our citizenships in it.
Okay. That's a pretty good definition of what we're to be, that we're, to be strangers in this world. When it goes through these 3 points, what makes us strangers, it talks about, we've been called out of this world and made citizens of a heavenly kingdom, and that we're following one whom the world has rejected. And we know that Christ was the ultimate when it comes to being rejected by the world. Somebody turn to John chapter 15. John chapter 15, verses 18 through 21. If somebody wants to read that whenever you get there.
The world hates you. You know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me.
Okay. So, I think that one of the difficulties that we have sometimes is we are in the world. We know that we're to be strangers in this world, but we don't like to be hated. I don't know if anybody here would say that they enjoy being hated. Most people, it's something that we like. We want to be liked. And we do things with our friends or people that we know to be liked. Maybe you're thoughtful of them. Maybe you do things for them. But there's an expectation, I think, that sometimes that desire to be liked can go and cause us to do things that maybe we shouldn't do, or to not do things that maybe we should do. We talk about this sometimes when we discuss, teaching and preaching to those that we're friends and that we care about. And we are so worried that our relationship with them is going to change if we bring up the Scriptures, bring up the gospel. And so we make all these justifications in our head of why we are deciding to wait. Now's not the good time. Now's not a good time. I have good intentions. I'm planning on bringing this up. I know that they're a good person, but I just don't think that right now is the best time. And that rock continues to get kicked down the road. Sometimes we never get the opportunity. But a lot of that is because we are so afraid that our relationship, our friendship with them is going to change. What's the irony in that? We think that we love them. We want them to love us. Yet we withhold what? The most important aspect of what our lives should be. And they may see those things in our lives. And oftentimes, have you realized that sometimes you want to talk to someone about the Scriptures and they're the ones that bring it up? And you may even avoid it then. They're the ones that bring up, where do you go to church? And you're like, well, I attend 84th Street Church of Christ. So, but are y'all planning on eating this afternoon? Because you don't want to get into it right then. You have all these justifications. I know I've been guilty of that, because I know if we go down that rabbit hole, then they're going to realize that I don't believe that they're in a safe condition. And that bothers a lot of people. And yes, it could damage that friendship. But we talk about this, the love that we should have for our friends, the love that we should have for mankind, is to try to teach and preach the gospel. Does anybody have anything on that? Yeah, John.
Well, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about, if you're a true believer, if you believe in heaven, and you believe that that you will go to hell if you don't obey, their question was, how much do you have to hate somebody to not tell them about Christ?
Yeah.
I was kind of off John's what I was thinking about. If it's something, say we buy a product somewhere, and it's like the greatest product we've ever we believe in it. It's like, wow, you won't believe that.
So I think sometimes, as hard as it is for us to, admit that or to consider ourselves in that, maybe we're not talking to people because we're not as convicted or as convinced as we need to be. Maybe our faith isn't what it needs to be. Not that we don't believe it's the truth, not that we don't know the truth. Are we convicted enough? Are we excited about it enough to
Yeah.
know about it?
That's a good point, DJ.
To that point, it's, they're not going to get mad at you for offering them that product, So that's where this comes in, is he's warning us that if we're living this life and we're spreading this truth, people will hate you, and you have to be ready for that because it's not like anything else when you tell them about it. They might praise you because it's going to help them. They might reject it. And they're going to hate you because some won't accept it. And that's the point is it's a truth that is going to happen. Some will respect you and change your life, but most of the world is going to hate you and reject you and treat you awful. But we have to do this anyways.
Yeah. Shanae?
Well, this passage is ironically comforting in the sense of, I think often if we have approached someone and we got a bad response, that deters us. We're like, oh, we must have done it wrong. And I'm not saying that you don't even think about how you approach things, but I think we need to not take that as a fail. I mean, God says that's what's going to happen, and Jesus did do it perfectly, and they killed him because of his preaching and teaching. He didn't do anything wrong, So I think often what deters us is what should be an encouragement. Okay, I'm doing something right, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's all kinds of factors. I think, kind of what Jeff was talking about, there is a question of how much do you believe it? Because he brought up the point of a product that you like or something like that. You talk, or maybe even a restaurant. I know that if me and Janae eat at a restaurant that we're just like really impressed with, we're constantly talking to people about that and wanting to tell people you need to try this place out or something like that. But one of the reasons I think that many Christians aren't more aggressive or more passionate about this is perhaps they have something in their life that they haven't fully given up, that maybe this person is aware of. And they are afraid of the hypocrisy that's going to be brought out. And so, obviously, that has to be cleared up. You have to take care of that first before you try to bring anybody else to Christ. And I'm not saying that everything, they may bring something out that you weren't even aware of, and you can tell them, I shouldn't have done that, or whatever it is. It shouldn't dissuade you, but that can also be a reason. Point number 3 is disciples no longer think like the people of the world. Somebody turn to Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. Go ahead whoever gets there.
And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
All right, so in this point, it says, a previous lesson we discussed how the Lord is the potter and the disciples are clay. The Lord fashions and molds us through his teaching. And then dropping down, becoming a disciple of Christ changes the way we think. No longer conforming to the way the world wants us to think, our minds are transformed or changed to the thinking the way Christ wants us to think. Since we no longer use worldly wisdom, philosophies, priorities, values, goals, we no longer fit in with the people of the world. We're like strangers in a strange land. So what are some ways that you as a Christian think differently than those of the world, or should? In what aspects of life are you different? What makes you different? Dave?
Lord, we have a standard from God that we follow.
Okay.
And we submit to that standard, and we should stand out of that. The world will have ethical or situational ethics. There's lots of ways to look at this. The way we view sin, the way we talk, the way we act, the way we dress. We should stand out. We're peculiar people. We should be a light.
Okay.
I think the especially in today's age, I don't have to deal with that like everyone else does having secular jobs, is that all of these, social problems and whether you're going to be offensive and stuff, are you willing to stick to your guns because the Bible says there's only two genders and so on and so forth. You're willing to do your job, you're not going to budge a little bit, but Christians shouldn't. And people don't get that. You're willing to lose your whole career for some small fact in their mind. And it's true.
Yeah. DJ?
And having conversations with others, it's kind of, he referenced it, it's, why do you do that? Well, who's the Lord? Why do you do that? Well, it's because what I like. Even when our thoughts on how we even worship, it's what God says. I've had this exact same conversation with someone on why do you use music? Well, it sounds better. We think how God instructs us to do, and then they think of what they want.
Is anybody else? Yeah.
I know a lot of people in the world that, well, most everybody, you're in constant search of something. And if you're not in Christ, what are you searching for? And I know before I became a Christian, I was constantly searching what was right. I didn't really know what I know now in the Scriptures. And the beautiful thing about the transformation is that once you understand the gospel and what it represents as far as a kingdom, like our sermon that we just heard, and what that entails, a lot of the answers that you have in life are answered. And that in itself can make you different. People will be looking for, because they're searching for something. And God is using us as a pathway in order to help them see that.
Amen.
And that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that people understand there is a different way that is better than what you're searching for.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there, as far as our view, our concept of the way that we live life, everything should be centered around our walk as a Christian. The decisions that we make, whether they be small or big or whatever, they should have that filter of Christ before any decision that we make. And I say that in the sense of like whatever job that we decide to take, wherever we decide to move, is there going to be brethren that we're going to be able to worship with and things like that. It should be something that it's on the forefront of our mind in every decision that we make. Somebody have something? So the next thing, moving on, is on page 61, what does it take to live like strangers and pilgrims? First thing that it mentions is faith. Disciples must walk by faith and not by sight. As we read in 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, we live in a physical world, but we operate by spiritual reality, standards, and promises. To have a relationship with God, we must believe that He exists and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. And it goes back to the example of Abraham and Sarah, which is kind of the context behind this lesson, because they were strangers and pilgrims in their life. When God told Abraham in Genesis to leave everything that he knew as home and to go to this place that he hadn't seen, he took his belongings and left. But the first point, trusting in God's promises. Somebody turn to Romans chapter 4 and verses 20 through 21.
He did not waver at the promises of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convicted that what he had promised, he was also able to perform.
Okay. What's the example? I mean, there were multiple examples of Abraham and his faith, but what's one of the ones that we obviously think about? Okay. The courage that Abraham had to be willing to sacrifice his own son is something that I think that probably most of us here, it's a difficult concept to understand. We would hope that if we were ever in that position, that we would be able to show the same faith. And it's talked about, he knew that Isaac was the son of promise, and even though he had never seen someone be raised from the dead, that if anybody could do it, it was God. And I think sometimes we say that we have faith, we feel like we have faith, but when difficult things arise, how does our faith measure up? We try to take things, and put it on our own shoulders and try to take care of things ourselves instead of, letting go and letting God take care of things. I think that that's a good example of what Abraham did is, we see mistakes that he made in his life, but his pilgrimage, his faith shown in God to see something, or, God made this covenant with him, these promises with him, that he was willing to give up everything and go. It says in the second part of trusting in God's promises, there's an aspect of uncertainty living as a pilgrim. We have no stake in this world, no rights, no place, etc. Our faith must be shown by trusting God to take care of us, to see us through this life, and to reward us in the end. Most of us here probably have some type of ownership in something, and it may be house, land, it may be just a vehicle, it may be whatever it is. We own things. If you're wearing clothes, then more than likely you own them. I doubt anybody's renting, but if you are, anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Y'all know what I mean. We have ownership in things. But this idea of being a pilgrim, of traveling through a land and not having ownership in that property is something that if we had to do that would cause us probably a great deal of stress. It would be difficult. We like to be home. We like to have our things. We know what it's like. And we talked about this, Wednesday night, that when you're traveling, if you're traveling and everybody's different. Some people are like, let me be free. I'll be a nomad for the rest of our lives. But I would say that the majority of people at a certain point on their travels like to be back home. They know they're comfortable there. Well, this whole idea of being strangers and pilgrims is to try to show us what? This isn't our home. And we get so comfortable sometimes in this world being our home. And we're surrounded by people that treat this world as their home. They're constantly thinking that this world is all what it's all about. And they're telling you, especially when you look at colleges and universities and things like that try to teach you that, this is what it's all about. You need to try to be successful. You need to try to get a lot of money. You need to have a job or have a business. Try to be productive in this life because this is what it's all about. When it talks about Abraham, it says there in point number 2, obedience to God's instructions. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed God. In Hebrews 11, chapter 11, and verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Have you thought about, I know Abraham is a good example of obedience, but I think that we've discussed this before, maybe in different Bible studies or maybe amongst yourselves, that if the scriptures were written today about the church today, would you be an example? And if you were, what kind of example would you be? I've thought about that. We've talked about if Paul was to write to a church or write about a church and he was to write to 84th Street, what would he write? Would he commend us on things? Would he tell us that we were needing to improve on things? And what would those things be? But if we were to be written about, what kind of example would we be? Would we be somebody like Abraham or Daniel or Joseph, someone who led in such a way and showed great amounts of faith and courage in the midst of very dangerous things that happened in their life? Or would we be other examples, Ananias and Sapphira, who, claimed that they had given everything that they had, or that they had given all, and obviously they were lying. King Agrippa, I think about him because he was so close. In Acts chapter 9, what is it? In the book of Acts, Paul is talking to King Agrippa, and what is the phrase that King Agrippa said that we're all familiar with? You almost persuaded me. Almost. And there are people that we have talked to about the gospel of Christ that maybe haven't used these words, but you feel like we're almost there. They will agree with you on 90% of what you're talking about. But when it comes to certain things, that's a roadblock for them. And they may not say these words, almost thou persuadest me, but in so many words, in their actions, they are showing you, I can't get over this. And oftentimes, one of the biggest factors is because of the relationship they have with their own family. Because they feel like that if their obedience towards this gospel of Christ, that it's going to condemn someone in their family. And I think that there's a realization that we have to understand that whether we obey or not, that consequence will not change. If that is the determining factor in our obedience, then we have to realize that if I obey or if I don't obey doesn't change the status of those that I love and care about. And the same thing happens in the church. We can't be brought down by brothers and sisters in Christ who are weaker in the faith because we feel justified that they are brothers and sisters in Christ. If they continue to walk unruly and continue to walk disorderly, then it's our job, it's our obligation to try to bring them back into the fold. So we have to make sure that obedience is something that we're constantly doing. The questions, I never get to the questions. Yeah, they're pretty simple. In fact, the questions, they're kind of if you read the text and you read it, they're kind of a one-word answer. We'll get to some of them, but does anybody have anything on that, obedience? Yep.
You look at walking by faith, and, I appreciate the example of other people and having that roadblock, but when I look in the man in the mirror, do I have a block? I might look good on Sunday and Wednesday, but what am I on Tuesday? Am I obeying the whole counsel of God? Am I picking the part I want to obey and ignoring the other part? Look at me, a pilgrim. Am I a pilgrim? Or do I, you mentioned ownership. Do I hold dear to these physical things on this earth? Well, my actions will tell you what I am. My actions are going to tell you whether I hold dear to things on this earth, or my actions are going to tell you whether I trust in God. And I need to look in the mirror and truly judge my own actions and know where I'm at.
I think it's important that, along with this point of obeying God's instructions is how you walk by God, how you live like a stranger and a pilgrim is, the reason we would balk at that and making that substantive and super important is because you've got the world acting in ways, and they're claiming to follow Christ. They're acting in ways as if they are looking to heaven. They're not meant for this place. This is not where they want to be. They want to be in heaven with Christ. But they separate that from, and that's their idea of faith, is to just kind of do what they feel. But they separate that from the commandments because they think that the commandments aren't spiritual. The commandments aren't about living for heaven. It's about the feeling you have. It's about spiritual things just are more like this mysticism and stuff. But Bruce preached a sermon on authority, and he pointed out an important passage in Matthew 8 about how the centurion had faith that Jesus could just say and do, and he says, what great faith, but it's because of his understanding of authority in that passage. And so if we're really wanting to walk by faith and live spiritual lives, because that comes by revelation, we trust in what God says. And if he says, you abstain from sexual immorality, and that means you're living for heaven, or if you living spiritually. And so if we're really looking for heaven, it's by the book. That's how we got to do it. Sincerely, but by the book.
That's a good point.
Piggyback onto those, David and Jeremiah, is that the world, for some reason, thinks that faith is some blind belief and confidence in something that they feel. It's not. We always talk about Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So when we do what God tells us to do, that shows our faith in Him. Abraham didn't come up with this crazy concoction on his own that he was going to sacrifice Isaac and somehow, have faith that God. No, he was doing what God exactly told him to do. And so when we do exactly what God tells us to do, and we have confidence in that, that's the faith that we need to have that will get us to heaven.
That's a very good point. Scott, Jeff?
You asked at the first, if Christ or the Bible was to have a story about you, what would that story be? I think of that often. I break it down even a little more personal, where I think of all through the Bible, God changes people's names, or He gives them nicknames. And I think often, what would my nickname be? What would they change my name to or my nickname be? And I would suggest pick one and then strive to be that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And that's a good point. There's a lot of names that are in the scriptures that mean something. Well, I always think of Barnabas, being the son of encouragement, and how that would be, one of the most kind things I think that anybody could say about you is that you are an encouraging person. Some people have that gift of being very encouraging, and some people it's difficult and they try. Does anybody have anything else? So the third point is coming out of the world. Will somebody turn to 1 Peter 1, 15 through 17, and somebody else turn to 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 18. Whoever gets to, unless I need to call on somebody. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. You'll read that.
But as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, "Be holy, for I am holy." And if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear.
Okay. And then, actually, let's wait on 2 Corinthians. If you've got that, you can just hold it there. It says there in that point number 3 in your book, we may be in the world, but we are not of the world. And this, this lesson is in a way kind of redundant in the sense of the idea that we are to be strangers in this world is the point. But it says there in that second paragraph, as sojourners and pilgrims, we are to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against our souls, pulling us away from Christ and causing us to forfeit our home in heaven. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, it says, "Beloved, I urge you, sojourners and pilgrims, to abstain from the..." And I've got this on English Standard Version, which it doesn't matter, but it looked weird to me because it's not normally what I use. "Beloved, I urge you, sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul." It says there in that point that if we fall in love with this world and become attached to this world, we will perish with this world. What are some ways, what are some difficult things that are... what are some ways that we can become attached to this world? In your own life, maybe in your own experiences, or maybe in the experiences of people that you care about, that you've seen fall down this trap of falling in love with this world. What are the ways that happens?
We kind of talked about at the beginning, when you value your earthly relationships more so than your relationship with Christ, and that you're not willing to jeopardize that relationship with a friend for the sake of Christ. I mean, that's, in my mind, when Jesus says anyone who wishes to save his life will lose it, he's not just talking about
losing your physical life. He's talking about what your life is encompassed by, your job, your relationships, maybe the prestige that you have among people in the world. If you're on if you're a sports team or something like that, I mean, not willing to sacrifice the things of this world if it means having to deny or to stand up for Christ.
Yeah.
Well, we all have, it's just a fact we live in this world. There's no getting out of it until we pass from this world. So we do have to live here in amongst, the rest of the world. But as a Christian, we have to know our limits. And there's lines there that you have to draw, whether you're providing for your home and you're working. Well, you can't just have any job that's out there, because some of those are crossing the line that you can't have as a Christian. And so knowing God's word and asking and studying for that wisdom and that knowledge sets the tone for those limits that we have to know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Scott?
It talks about here fleshly lust. I mean, these houses that are being built nowadays, it is hard to drive through neighborhoods and not go, wow, you know what I mean? And then the cars in the driveways. Yeah. And I think of Abraham and Lot roaming around this home that's not theirs, and the promise is given to Abraham, but here they are, they've gotten so big that they can't collaborate, they're eating up too much, and Abraham says, Lot, you choose. Yeah. How hard would that be, thinking, I'm boss, you're my nephew, when he lets Lot choose first.
Yeah, and I mean, that example that they've gotten so big that their servants and their livestock they're having issues with it. It's kind of hard to imagine. I think, when it talks about this a little bit in the last paragraph, it says, we know we're to come out of this world, yet how many disciples of Christ act as if they are at home in this world? And there are certain things that I think each one of us probably have temptations with, and they could vary from person to person, whatever those may be. And we talked about this briefly before, but one of the best devices that the devil has is to use something that inherently isn't wrong, and if he can get a foothold in, to try to bring you down that way. We see this sometimes with, parents and children and activities and events and different things that people are involved in that in and of themselves are not bad things and could be very good things, and they're examples that they could be to those in the world. But the involvement and the passion and the care and the love of those things, you see a shift in their focus, in their lives, in the things that they care about, to where they're not as strong as they used to be. They don't care about these things like you used to see them care about. And I think that we all probably know someone, or maybe been guilty of this ourselves, of letting things that at one time or in and of themselves, like I said, aren't bad, but have distracted us. And I think that the reality is, it's oftentimes of trial, of trauma, of turmoil, of great disaster, whatever it is, that brings that focus back to what this life is all about. And I think that any of us that have experienced heartache or grief or pain in any type of way, if you ask us in that moment where you want to be, it's not on this earth. This earth is not home. And you're so thankful that it is temporary, because you're ready to go to heaven. But, a few years later, you start getting busy with things. You start having your schedule full. And those probably, I know this life. But we have to live here. We got to work. We got to eat. Those things. But if you ask somebody after a moment of tragedy or a moment of trial, or someone that they care about has passed, or maybe something's happened in your own life where you've lost everything that you own, you want this life to be temporary. and you're ready to go home. And I remember somebody telling me one time that they were ready to die, and I mean, somebody in good health, they were ready for this life to be over. And I used to think that was a pretty morbid thing to say. I was really surprised. And, you know, as I've gotten older, I've realized now what they mean of this life can be very difficult, and it can be very hard. And the trials that we face here, you know, the devil's trying to bring us down in every way that we can. Yeah, I thought you were telling me I had 2 minutes.
Wednesday night, you made the analogy about when you would go out of the country, how you felt like a stranger there, and to me that all goes back to a comfort zone, right? When you're in your comfort zone, you feel like you're at home. When you're outside of your comfort zone, walking through India, walking through wherever, you're well outside of that. You know you don't belong there. And so the point you just made around conveniences and schedules, that is probably the biggest temptation or challenge, or whatever you want to call it, that we have in 2023, is we're in our comfort zone. And it's really hard for us to step out of that and say, hey, I don't need to be in my comfort zone here because this is not where I long to be. I long to be somewhere else. And that's a real danger, I think, that we face because we don't even realize we're there. And it's not until you say, it's not something pushes us out of our comfort zone, whether that be a trial or a death or something else, that it kind of wakes you up and you have to realize this is not what I want to be.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I meant to bring up when about traveling is I think another difference that we have is most of the time we're hyper aware of our surroundings. You know, when you go to a new place, a new country or wherever that's not home, you're very sensitive to your surroundings. You're very aware of the way that people may be coming in contact with you or things that people are saying or distractions, and you're kind of noticing things, especially if you have a family that you care about, because you don't want yourself to be in danger. You don't really know these people. You don't know what's going to happen. Well, that is a perfect illustration of the way that we should be as Christians, as pilgrims in this world, of being aware of what's going on around us. Because anybody who has tried to be a Christian for any length of time, we are very aware of those things that bring us down, maybe brought us down in the past. And those are the things that we have to avoid. If those start to creep in, we have to nip those in the bud as quick as we can. Yeah.
I think in God's wisdom, us being strangers and pilgrims, exactly like what has been said, it's not our home, it makes us strive to be home. At the same time, Philippians 4 tells us to not be anxious for these reasons, and a peace that surpasses understanding. Well, by us not having ownership in this world, also relieves us from the cares of this world. We don't have to be concerned. God wants us to have a peaceable enjoy. He doesn't want us to be miserable in life. If that happens, and we have the faith that that's what we do, we don't have to worry about the stock market. We don't have to worry about our possessions. We have a different attitude about those things.
Yeah.
That we have that peace. We don't have to be concerned about the laws and the things that this world passes and politics.
Right.
And all the things that you look around that the world worries about, they become anxious about, and they're on medication for, and all those things. If we're truly a pilgrim, that stuff doesn't matter to us because we realize how temporary it is. This isn't where we're going to be in an eternity.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and it's a good closing point. The last two points, if you are reading a lesson or if you've done your lesson, talk about delaying gratification, the example of Abraham and Sarah, how they never saw this promise fulfilled completely, and then our commitment of seeing it through to the end. I appreciate your comments. Jeremiah's got the next one, and I think he's going to try to do it in one lesson, but I appreciate your comments. We'll be dismissed until our next service.